Sports is an umbrella organisation which was created in 2012 to increase the visibility and participation of lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender people in Scottish sport. So now it's time to hand me over to our chair for the evening, Fergus McMillan, who is the CEO of LGBT Youth Scotland.
So, to my right, on the end of the panel here, we're pleased to welcome Penelope Peacock.
My name is Penelope Peacock. I'm a partnership manager at SportsScotland. So SportsScotland's the National Institute for Sport in Scotland. So we invest in the people, places and partnerships that make sport happen. And I'm here tonight to discuss the work that we do with our governing bodies. So the governing bodies of sport in Scotland are going through an accreditation process called the Equality Standard for Sport, and I work with them closely on that, developing their action plans to help diversify their membership and their sport.
Secondly, I'd like you to welcome Kat to my right here.
Katharina Lindner. I'm a footballer. I've just retired from playing for Glasgow City. I'm German. I've also played for the German national team. I've played in the US for quite a few years as well. And I'm also, with my other hat on, I'm a lecturer at Stirling University, and I'm a kind of media and gender theorist. So I'm interested, I suppose, in the issues that we're kind of discussing tonight from kind of two different perspectives. One is the kind of, having been involved in sport and kind of having experienced the kind of issues that will come up. And on the other hand, kind of looking at those issues from a kind of theoretical and conceptual kind of, intellectual perspective, which I've always kind of really enjoyed doing. And I think that's also the reason why I'm here tonight. I think it's an issue that hasn't really, I suppose, received the attention probably that it should have. And because of quite a few sort of relatively well-known, players coming out recently, I think it's one of these issues that is being discussed a bit more regularly in the press as well. So I think it's quite a good time to get us talking about it as well.
We want to welcome Tam Hendry.
My name is Tam Hendry. I'm Chief Exec of Learning Link Scotland, which is the national body for adult learning organisations in the third sector. I'm here tonight because I've had recently worked at Hearts Football Club for 2 years, and a little bit of an insight into the inner workings of the club, and particularly around issues like equality and diversity and things like that. So hopefully I can add something to the debate.
And last, but by no means least, Stuart McDonald.
My name's Stuart McDonald. I'm here tonight on behalf of HotScots Football Club from Edinburgh, and also the GFSN, it's a Gay Football Supporters Network, who run a league organisation which is basically aimed at the LGBT community, and they also arrange social events for football supporters from the LGBT community as well. So I'm looking forward to a positive discussion tonight about the barriers that LGBT people still face in participating in sport, particularly football, and what we can do to overcome these.
And unfortunately the statistics don't always show that there is much change, but I think on sort of a case-by-case basis there is definitely change, and it is happening. Unfortunately, it is happening a little bit slower than we probably would like to see.
I think, for example, in relation to kind of out female athletes, that kind of still enjoy quite significant media profiles, I think it's a little bit different for gay men, I think, particularly in professional sports, which is something we might, I suppose, come back to a bit later on. But I think it really sort of depends on what kind of inequalities you talk about, whether it's kind of gender inequalities or kind of, sexuality-based inequality. And it also depends on the type of sport as well. So there are differences between kind of team sports and individual sports. And, it's much harder to come out as a team sport player than, somebody who plays tennis or whatever.
And I guess I was really shocked at how backward it really is. And I think it's a huge task. And it's an enormous task to change that culture certainly within football, that I saw behind the scenes. So I think it's a great industry for presenting a kind of face, but I think behind the scenes it's not really backed up with anything. So it's a huge job to move it from where it is. But like I said, it would be wrong to say there's not been any progress. I definitely think there has, but not enough to kind of change the culture inside.
The saddest thing for me is that homophobia in sport obviously stops a lot of people taking part in it, and so it's a loss for them that they feel unable to take part in sport, but it's also a loss for the sports themselves. I mean, with the GFSN, we've now thankfully started a dialogue with the Scottish Football Association, which is huge progress, and other organisations that here are involved in that, like the Equality Network and Leap Sport and so on. And they have a plan that they want to increase participation in sport, and to do that you need to cast your net as widely as you can, and if you're going to exclude 6 or 7% of the population straight off, then you're going to have difficulty in meeting those targets.
Why is that? Why only 21 openly gay athletes then in the Olympics last year? What does anybody think? Why is there a lack of openly gay elite or LGBT elite athletes?
I suppose in the international context, the first problem is still a lot of countries where even it's just not allowed. It's prohibited absolutely to be LGBT or to engage in LGBT activities. So it's not a surprise that there are many teams that turn up and there's no prospect of an LGBT athlete taking part from those countries.
Being openly gay, I think at this point, involves a kind of major statement, a kind of major public statement. And that's something that's kind of quite scary, bit scary in other kind of context, but having that kind of major public statement and the fact that you would need to do that in order to be an openly gay athlete. Gay athletes in particular in a kind of really difficult situation, because then it's kind of like, if you come out making a particular kind of public statement, it's like, you've thrown, you're rubbing your sexuality in everybody's face, whereas when a kind of straight athlete is asked by a reporter, well, what did you do, during the summer break, and they say, I'm going on holiday with my wife, that's not kind of seen as they're coming out as heterosexual. But if an athlete would say, I'm going on holiday with my boyfriend, that would be a kind of major statement. So I think there's, these kind of larger issues around kind of how do we identify straight people, because it's not like racism where you can kind of visibly see who you can address in certain ways and kind of what's wrong with, because sexuality is kind of invisible really, and I think that makes it more difficult.
Are we putting too much pressure then on athletes or on sports people, particularly elite sports people, by looking to them for the leadership to challenge homophobia and transphobia in sport?
I'm not sure about putting too much pressure on, but I do think, just listening to everyone talk, I think in sport, progress is really slow. So, you think about women's sport, disability sport, and the progress that's been made in the last 30 years, and we're still looking at numbers that aren't great, and we still want to improve sport for disabled people and sport for women. And, the LGBT agenda is kind of hot off the press at the moment. The equality legislation's really provided a platform for that. And I think that sports, we're expecting quite a lot of them, and we should be, because they should be meeting our expectations, but it's going to take a while to get there, I think. And I think with the high performance athletes who are individuals, like cyclists working individually, or kind of tennis players, as Kat kind of referred to before, they've got sort of a unique setup where they might have somebody that they can confide in, their coach or their nutritionist or their physiologist or somebody. But in teams or, in international sport, maybe the picture is maybe a little bit different.
Leadership doesn't necessarily have to come from LGBT sports people. It can come from other sports people speaking out as well. And it has happened on 2 or 3 occasions already down in England, where people have been happy to speak out or do interviews for gay magazines and so on. But there's not been any equivalents up here. And in fact, I think the FA at one point down south were having difficulties in persuading people to take part in a sort of campaign video as well. So it's not just that we have to try and encourage LGBT sports people to assist with the campaign if they're willing to do so, but the wider sporting community.
I would say that football is institutionally racist. And if it's institutionally racist, I can assure you it's even more institutionally homophobic. The fact that there's no British football players coming out at all, or they're not able to come out. It's not really that you need to kind of show it as a badge, but you need to be who you are. And that needs to be okay. For people to accept it. And also I think young people need role models. So people who do want to be role models can push the boundaries a bit and show what's possible. But to break into that culture, there's a lot. It needs more than just kind of incremental change. It needs people to get in and really mess that whole system up.
What is it actually like day to day for an LGBT footballer who's actually not out, who finds themselves gay on a football team? What would their day-to-day life be like?
But within that culture, it's really difficult for a young player to come out and show themselves out the mainstream. It's like, for me, I was working behind the scenes, and for me causing a problem behind the scenes, that was a big deal. Football player in amongst the football team, honestly, I can't imagine what it'd be like.
But I also agree, I think, with the point that there's an extent to which it's a tipping point, because I think once it's happened a couple of times, then you would hope that it would be easier after that. There will always be clubs and individuals. I mean, football can't solve this any more readily than society as a whole. homophobia exists out in our works and everywhere else, so we can't expect football to be any different. It's never going to be perfect. But you know,
it needs,
Bobby Rogers
it
is still
needs
playing
something
football.
a bit more radical to make it change.
How do we get LGBT people in sport up the agenda and make it as important, as equally important as all those other things? And how do we sell that, not just to LGBT people to take part in sport, but how do we sell that to sports bodies and say, you know, how do we do this together instead of, you know, we must tackle this problem and and these issues, and, you know, how do we do it holistically?
You know, the people that we work with, that work with our governing bodies, are aware of the LGBT agenda now, and they're pushing it with our sports. And that hasn't happened before, you know, and I think we've quite often let governing bodies make their own choices, and they sort of think, oh, well, you know, this looks good, or we quite fancy a program about this. And now we're saying, okay, but you really need to address this. You can't ignore it anymore. And especially it's a progressive program, so the further up they go, you know, the more that we would expect from them. But I think that it's got to be bigger than that, and it can't just be about the standard. It's absolutely not enough. And I think it's about supplying governing bodies and clubs with tools and resources that can make it easy for them to make some simple changes, you know. But I too am upset at that idea of people putting the t-shirt on, taking the photos, and then, oh, well, we've done that because that's what we have to do. And I don't know how you address that.
We get our mascots to go out and all the kids are saying, what's this all about? What does this mean? So you're immediately educating 22 young kids as to what it means, and that's just one club, one game. If you replicate that across Scotland, it means something. And I think from an LGBT aspect, you need to start to do that, because as Kat says, it's not visible. You can't spot that person, so it's going to have to really be as out there as showing cards and wearing t-shirts, and it might seem a token effort to begin with. But I actually think we need that token effort.
But it's also
I agree with what you're saying there. I mean, I wouldn't want to say show racism red card is not worthy. It's made a huge difference. And I think it's when moments of crisis happen, like happened with the Suarez situation at Liverpool. Liverpool looked really stupid because the context had been set, the teams had said, everybody said you're showing racism red card. And right away, Liverpool's behaviour was kind of exposed, and that was embarrassing. So it needs the visibility. So I totally agree. I wouldn't want to say don't do that. I think you really have to get the visibility.
But I was just going to kind of pick up on kind of what you were saying about, you know, having like little mascots with a t-shirt for racism red card. You couldn't have a 4-year-old with a t-shirt, you know, tackle homophobia or whatever, running out the pitch. You know, that is kind of
why not?
But I think most parents would be uncomfortable with it or whatever. So I think there's just kind of this sort of, you know, where it's become common sense that racism is something that's wrong, because, you know, partially I think this has to do with kind of this assumption that, you know, nobody could do something about the fact that they're a particular kind of race. But I think there's still sort of this kind of, sometimes this assumption that maybe, you know, that homosexuality is kind of like a lifestyle or something people choose to do to a certain extent, or something that, you know, that's not normal or not natural, and it's something that actually, you know, whereas racism, you know, nobody I think would publicly sort of, few people would publicly make a statement saying that they think that, you know, black people are kind of inferior or whatever to white people. But I think there is still a bit more of that opinion that actually homosexuality, that's something that's kind of an illness, or something that's kind of is a kind of defect, or something that's kind of not normal, or something wrong with that person. And I think that has to do with it a little bit as well, that there's this kind of...
So what does anyone else think on the panel about how you approach this with young people? So young people tell us that in experiencing homophobia and transphobia at school, in particular, they experience that in physical education and sport.
I think governing bodies are in the ideal place to address this. Even in the discussions with the SFA, you know, it was the first meeting, but they did have some very good ideas about longer term. You know, we're not going to solve racism or any other discrimination with the display of cards and t-shirts. It's helpful, it gives profile to the issue. But in the longer term, the best ideas they had were just involvement with their network of community coaches. I mean, they have thousands of people going through their coaching schools every year, and already their sort of coaching courses include an element which deals with racism. So they are definitely going to look into the idea now of tackling homophobia at that level as well. If somebody's of the attitude that, you know, sending BNP texts around and about is fine, you're going to really struggle to change that ever. You might be able to do it with education, but in the longer term, far more effective ways are going to get getting in about it at grassroots level from an early age. So
I think you've got to be aware of the limitations of the community coaches as well and the culture that they come through, because even that network can be, really, awful at times as well. I mean, lots of good people doing it, but it's really about education, helping people to make that move.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's the level of sophistication there in the coaching network to be able to roll out an education campaign about addressing homophobia. It is a bit easier with racism. Show racism in the right car, because we go, yeah, that's fine, get a t-shirt, and they will build that into their coaching. I think they're quite a long way from getting to the point where they would do that with homophobia.
And I think it has to do also very much with people who are kind of, anti-homophobic publicly. There's always this kind of sense that they're thought to be gay, or that there's a kind of risk, I suppose, for straight people who kind of identify with kind of anti-homophobic campaigns, that they're associated with it. And I think that's also sometimes why straight sports stars or whatever don't publicly support it, because then there's a sense, then they'll be accused of being gay themselves. And I think that's the difference also with racism, because you don't become black just because you're anti-racist.
Sports Scotland fund the governing bodies. What follow-up? I imagine that there's some kind of that your equality mark you push on to them.
Yeah.
What follow-up is there on the governing bodies to show that they are fulfilling that?
I mean, the Sports Scotland funding would be going to the athletes that have got the best promise, and that's all that they need to have, to get through to sort of, international teams, or at the moment the Commonwealth Games, where governing bodies, if they might be directing some of that funding, but ultimately it's coming from us. So, I don't know if there's governing bodies maybe that have their own ways of dealing with their funding, all the policies and all the procedures that we would help them put in place, we would hope would prevent them from, undertaking that sort of discrimination.
It's the follow-up, what are you actually doing about homophobia?
Maybe I should say a little bit more about the process. That might make it a little bit clearer. So, say if a governing body is going for foundation level, there's sort of like 4 or 5 different things they need to do. They need to evidence that, and it gets independently verified. So at that stage, that's where we're saying, what exactly is going on? What are you doing? What are you delivering? And it's also their opportunity. We're starting to change the way they report it for them, to do something that they can publish, so that they can actually say, this is all the stuff that we're doing. Because quite often they're doing a lot of stuff. They're just not maybe necessarily talking about it. And then in 3 years' time, we would go back and re-look at that.
Really successful LGBT people with businesses, encouraging them to kind of sponsor sports stars. If there was money around, then there'd be more, maybe some people would come out, because, right, okay, I'll take that sponsorship, I don't know. But there must be money out there. There must be corporate money that would be able to invest.
And I think that's also where the kind of gender difference, I think, is really quite significant. So there are quite a few kind of out, lesbian athletes who, in tennis or in golf, for example. Or last year, I think it was just before the Olympics or after, that one of the kind of American, international soccer players, one of their kind of most, I suppose, visible player came out kind of publicly. And that doesn't seem to have done anything to their kind of, corporate support or kind of public visibility and profile. But I think it would be a lot more difficult for a male athlete.
Robbie Rogers, for example, I don't know how that will have affected his sponsorship. He's obviously still playing for one of the big teams in America. I think it would be slightly more difficult for somebody who's playing in maybe the second division, the Scottish League, and was a sort of mediocre journeyman professional. That's not going to attract much more sponsorship, I suspect, and they'd probably disappear without a trace. So.
Actually, I would be a supporter of any of my colleagues coming out. And actually, that's a very little press coverage. And in terms of role models, I think that it's very much a personal feeling is, unless we crack that really hard nut, which is men's professional football, then actually we're not going to get any real change, and we're not going to get the messages. And I think some of the stuff you were saying in the beginning, Penelope, as well, I'm very aware of. I think there's some fantastic work going on. I think the Rugby Union, for example, has done some amazing work, but actually that's not really up there. Nobody's really looking to that. This culture and we talked a bit earlier about gender, and that this culture looks to football as the leader, and until we crack that, I don't feel that we're going to progress. I just wondered what the panel thought.
Okay. I just think there's too much focus on the SFA. I would really like to see another governing body stand up and go absolutely mad for LGBT rights and put some really great programs in place, really great awareness campaigns, and show the SFA how it's done. Why wait around for the SFA to do it? Let's get other governing bodies on board and, really got to raise that awareness. And I think that that's something, through the action plan or the reference group, is really thinking about awareness. And I just think there's so much focus on football. I know it's a national game. I know it's got high levels of participation, but loads of other sports do too.
Football, if it's going to change, I don't think football on its own will change unless there's a way of getting visibility that they find acceptable, but it'll always be on their terms that way. It'll take a long time. I think the time is right. People, there is more awareness now, and people are, more accepting and tolerant and what have you. So I think that maybe if people can come up with a way to get into that sector and noise it up a bit, really. That's what I would say, noise it up a bit. Because then they're just too focused on the business, and they're too focused on the football on the Saturday to be concerned with anything else, really.
There are, for example, instances of kind of domestic violence spike every time the Rangers play Celtic, which obviously doesn't happen that much anymore, or hasn't happened that much last year. But that kind of, it's kind of linked to other kinds of violence and kind of inequality in such a kind of deep-rooted way that's really difficult to kind of, and I think that's what makes Scottish football different from other kinds of football in other countries, that it's so ingrained with kind of religion, obviously, but also just
it's kind of
culture
tribalism as well. You're trying to break into that tribal mentality as well.
And it's a working class kind of issue as well. And I think that's where some of the, when you talk about kind of education and awareness raising and stuff like that, I think that's kind of where some of the issues come from as well, to a certain extent.
When the first Premier League player comes out, it's going to be an English player, more than likely. So we have to learn from that in Scotland, I think, and sort of take what we can from it. It's not going to happen in Scotland before it happens in England, I think.
There you go, there's a challenge. We're noising it up. Thank you, Heather. Good, right. So it's going to happen in England first and not in Scotland.
It has already happened. We mentioned before about Justin Fashanu, so he had a pretty tragic life. We were saying when he went to Hendry, one of the least open clubs you would imagine, and he used to sing, he's black, he's gay, he plays for Hendry. And I'd just like for them to sing that on the terraces was actually quite a good thing. So it's happened, but nothing else has happened. And then maybe because his experience was so tragic, people steered away. But it has happened before.
And do you think things like the gay games and things are setting membership further, as in you have to be gay to play in this game, so you're not inclusive with everybody else?
You don't have to be gay to go to the gay games either. No. Welcoming everybody again, but it's just again marketed as a sporting event, perhaps unlike the Olympics, from what we're hearing, that you can go along and no questions will be asked about your sexuality at all. Not great. I mean, that was when I referred to HotScots being abroad before. That was where we went to Cologne for the gay games in 2010. Absolutely fantastic experience, and they also make a very good job of it's all the different standards. Even the football, we had some extremely good football teams, coming from America or Argentina and so on, right the way down to folk who it was really just a hobby, and a whole range of sports as well, so all age groups. It was a superb event, and things like that I think are tremendous for encouraging participation.
I'd love to see the day when the SPL clubs have their own LGBT club. I mean, it's interesting, women's football, I mean, you've seen over the years the mainstream clubs have all got a women's club now. And Hearts, a few years ago, more or less adopted Musselburgh Windsor ladies team, and they became Heart Midlothian Football Club. It'd be great to get to that stage where each club felt they could have an LGBT club.
You can have a word with your friends at Hearts.
Oh, I'll not make any difference. I'll not make any difference.
Divorcing sport from society as a whole, and I think where we are internationally, just as society as a whole, in terms of LGBT issues, is probably where we are in sport as well. Where, West European, so you've got some countries that are ahead of us, say in equal marriage legislation, but plenty of countries that are miles behind us as well. And I think it's in the same sport. We're a little bit behind some of the front runners, but I think there is a cultural change more generally, and I think sport is probably even just a little bit behind the country as a whole. But it's not in a terrible place compared to some. There is progress, and I think there will be more progress in.
Sport being a field in politics, and Harvey Milk said that should have bullet pass through Wembley and let it knock down every closet door. So it could be a yes or no question. Do you think that LGBT sports people have a responsibility and obligation to come out publicly? You say like you don't need to come out to be gay, but do they have some sort of responsibility to come out?
I'll say no.
Okay, thank you. Kat?
I would say no as well, and I could.
You could say more.
Just so qualify this, but I don't think there should be an obligation on anybody to come out in any kind of way.
Tam?
Well, definitely no obligation, but it would be great to see some role models. It would be great.
Yeah, no but is it?
Broke the rules. Yeah, good. Okay. If we can take the last 2 points then, and just unless there's any other points, no other points before we finish. So yes, right.
It's a kind of random country question, or going back to the countries. Do you feel that the other countries influence Scotland? Just coming from America, obviously, we don't really hear much about what happens in the UK and in Scotland, but do other countries kind of influence the direction that you all go, or do you all feel that it's pretty stuck in the way y'all would do it normally?
Okay. Let's take those 2 points. Let's take the points in reverse order then. First of all, panel, if you can respond to the bit about do other countries influence what's happening here, and also Scott's point about if governing bodies could do one thing, what would that be? And we'll come back to the Commonwealth Games for a grand finale. So who would like to respond to those 2?
I can start if you like. I really liked Scott's question. I think it's a great question. And I think the one thing that I would like to see is an awareness campaign. So maybe a charter that all the governing bodies sign up to, that's coupled with some kind of awareness campaign that is like a t-shirt or a signpost, getting athletes involved, politicians involved, SportsScotland staff involved. And I think that could be a really nice platform and a really nice way to kind of start things. What was the second question?
The second question was around do other countries have influence on what's happening here?
I think from a strategic perspective from SportsScotland, I mean, I can't kind of speak wider than that, but we work very closely together, all the sports councils. So I think that, I go and I learn what's happening in England and Wales and Northern Ireland, and, the issues are very different, like especially when you think about Northern Ireland. I mean, you think that we're in the Stone Ages. They've got a big path ahead of them. But we do already learn from each other, and we do sort of share strategically what's happening. So I think from SportsScotland's perspective, that really influences the work that I do, definitely.
I would probably say from a sort of football perspective, I don't think Scotland's learning from anybody, and it never has, because if you kind of look at I think Scotland is a very open country up until, when it comes to football, it's like there's even from the kind of style of play, it's kind of like how other teams played like 40 years ago, and we still think in Scotland that that's the way to go, even though it's brought nothing but lack of success. But I think there is this sort of like this Scottish kind of, you need to get kind of down and dirty and lots of tackles and who passes the ball, this kind of thing. And I think this actually has to do with this kind of particular kind of masculinity that's associated with football, that's kind of physical and rough and tough and violent. And, I think sometimes sort of that kind of, I suppose, accusation of kind of homosexuality or gayness or whatever is very often kind of, teams like Arsenal, for example, it actually has to do very much with the kind of style of football they play sometimes as well. And I think there's a link actually between sort of this, the way of playing football and how there's no better way of playing it, even though it never brings any success. But I think that has to do with the kind of not learning from outside influences as well, I think, because there's this particular kind of mentality.
That sounds like maybe the topic for your next debate. That sounds good. Okay.
I do think Scotland is very parochial, but I'm quite optimistic. I think they do learn from other countries too. I think they do look for other examples. I think the playing style is the exception to it. So I think there's potential there, and I couldn't top, Penelope, what you suggested as the one thing that we could do. I think definitely an awareness-raising campaign. I think the SPL Trust is probably a bit more productive route to go for football than the SFA, perhaps, because they're a charity and they can go and get joint funding with LEAP or something like that. You can come up with a project, pitch it to them, and they'll buy into it. So it might be a way to do something about it.
Sure. I mean, it's hard. I think Britain as a whole has been sort of cut off as a sort of football nation, and Scotland obviously is part of that, is behind in terms of football style and all sorts of other things as well. And it's not necessarily just for want of trying, because we obviously had a German manager not so long ago who...
Well, he was very successful.
Yeah, well, exactly. And currently, the performance director is Mark Vota, who's got, as I understand it...
Dutch, who's very different from German.
Sure. But, at least we're looking to other ideas.
I know.
But it takes time for these things to change. But yeah, of course, you're influenced by other countries, and I think particularly in the British Isles, we do all influence each other, even things like smoking policy or minimum pricing. One country will take a lead and others will maybe see how it goes and follow on. And in terms of football, yeah, we see so much Premiership football now, then we do probably copy take our lead from down south in some respects. One action, it's not easy. I suspect I'll probably take the easy answer and agree with the idea of an action plan, but at the very least a very firm and clear statement that homophobia is as unacceptable as racism and any other form of discrimination. I think we've been quite slow to get that message across, and it's been sort of seen as we'll maybe deal with that later, and it has to be given the same priority as all these other forms of discrimination.
Okay, the final question then to respond to tonight, panel, is about the Commonwealth Games. Looking forward, hopefully maybe ending on a wee bit of a positive note, thinking about what the opportunity might be through 2014 for LGBT people and their engagement in the Commonwealth Games, and how we maybe make that a better experience than what we started off the debate with in talking about the Olympics. So would anyone like to respond to that?
None of us in this panel apparently take the view that there's an obligation or responsibility on athletes to declare themselves publicly as out. That would also make a campaign much easier if you had a figurehead. But in the absence of that, then just highlight the work of the community groups and what's going on, and hopefully there's a lasting legacy in terms of increased participation.
I think there might be an opportunity. I mean, given that so little happened for the Olympics, that I think the Scottish Government are quite interested in showing how they can do things better. So the fact that was happened there, we could do a better job at the Commonwealth Games. So I think they'd be very open. I'd like to think they would be. What do you think?
I've got an update there.
Yeah, okay. But for me, that would be a way to go to put pressure there to try and get some investment so we can get a bit of visibility for the Commonwealth Games.
I think in general it's important to somehow create an environment where it's kind of safe and not risky to come out.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that kind of the organisers of the Commonwealth Games, I think, have probably a big role to play in kind of creating that environment in some way. And that kind of, I think you mentioned earlier, kind of, sponsorship and kind of commercial interests and how they are actually quite important. And, actually one of the reasons why kind of in general, I think again, LGBT people are kind of a lot more visible is because they actually have become recognised as a consumer group. So people are actually, who've got quite a lot of money to spend. And I think that's something, obviously a bit cynical, but something to kind of play on, because if, you can get probably quite a big sponsor that, might be quite openly kind of targeting both LGBT athletes and kind of fans or whatever, just because the market's there, and I think that kind of, that's something to kind of take more advantage of, I think.
I think it would be really nice to do something like this. And I think after the Games even, to do something like this and to try and get some clubs on board to do taster sessions for all sports that people have seen throughout the Games. I think, if you're talking about getting influences from other home countries, if you do look at the Women's Sport and Fitness Foundation and the Disability Federation, I can't remember their full name, down in England, they've really done some great campaigning post-games. And interestingly, I'm not sure how much visibility they had during the games. I mean, obviously there's the Paralympics, but, I think the way the games was led on to things that obviously people hoped that it would, but you're never kind of really sure, but when there's people like Jessica Ennis and then all of a sudden it's all about women's sport and, they've kind of really jumped on the bandwagon. I mean, it is hard if you don't get a person, but I think the opportunities are there and, hopefully a partnership with Commonwealth Games is going to start up in the near future and you'll be able to see some of that work.
Thank you for your participation. That was really good that everybody participated in the way that you did. And I hope you'll agree with me that I think the panel represented a real interesting mixture of experience and viewpoint about the topic. So can we say a big thanks to Tam, Stuart, Kat and Penelope for that participation.
She was sort of commenting on how